Well, welcome back. This is the fourth lecture on the Canonical Parables. I don't think I've got too much more to cover. Well, who knows? There may be a fifth lecture. We'll just have to see. And remember that the last lecture in this series, I'll be trying to deal with the questions that you folks have raised about Dom Crossan's article on parables. So that lecture may be a little bit long in coming. All right. I want to start this section with probably one of the most important points I can make about the parables themselves. And this point is made very well by many different scholars, but I've got here on the screen for you a couple quotations from some of the biggies. One of them, of course, is Dom Crossan himself, where he says that parables are lures for interpretation. And that word lure is really important. I'm going to explain why in just a minute. C.H. Dodd says that the purpose of parables is to tease the mind into active thought. And the way that I tend to explain the point that they're making is for us to understand Jesus's parables, we need to understand, first of all, that their purpose was to draw the listener into the story. And then actually, in one sense, to close the hand. The readers need to be able to identify with the story, with at least one person in the story, usually more. Actually, sometimes just one, and identify with them and be drawn into the story. And then Jesus makes this simple but very powerful point with the conclusion of the story, and all of a sudden, the listeners or the readers are caught in kind of a theological, intellectual trap. And the way Jesus uses parables, more often than not, actually, they're tools and arguments with the Pharisees. And they demonstrate a very sophisticated argumentative style on behalf of Jesus. But this notion here, this point is that the parables make a simple point. If we work with them, and you're going to talk about this in your analysis of the parables in your paper, but we need to find out what that simple surface point is. But wow, and that's the point that everybody listening to the story is supposed to get. But then, as the story moves on, all of a sudden, the people who are identifying with the character in the story suddenly actually look for the nearest exit. Because they begin to realize, whoa, this story is not going in the direction that I thought it would. And Jesus is getting them to see something that is really quite profound. So first, very important point about the parables is that these things were very powerful, almost mind games in a sense. And their purpose was to draw the listeners into the story. Now, the second point about this, and I don't have this up on the screen right now. It's something that has occurred to me since I typed this up for you. But the second very important point about the parables is that for us to understand these things, we really need to try to listen to them with the ears of first century Palestinian Jews. And it's hard to do because we're obviously not from that time or place. We see the world so very differently. There's what we call that interpretive gap, the hermeneutical gap between ourselves and the hearers and readers of these stories. And it's very hard to do. But for us to understand the power of some of these parables, to understand how Jesus was calling somebody, luring somebody into the story to identify with somebody, and then all of a sudden close the door and make a very powerful point. We've got to know pretty well how they might have been understood by a first century Palestinian Jew. One of the best illustrations of this principle I stumbled on in a book that I highly recommend to you. It's by Amy Jill Levine. I might have mentioned her to you before. It's called The Misunderstood Jew, the Church and the Scandal of the Jewish Jesus. The Misunderstood Jew, the Church and the Scandal of the Jewish Jesus. You can probably find, this is a paperback copy. I don't think it cost very much money. Anyway, she's talking about the importance of what I was just saying, that trying to identify with the audience try to understand who was listening to these things, try to understand the way they would have thought about these parables. And she does this, and if you get the book, I'm starting actually on page 37, where she's been talking about one of the classic parables. And I'm going to read the parable. It's a short one here for you. And then I want you to hear what she has to say about it. She made some points about this that I'd never thought about. Anyway, this parable is from Luke 18, starting at verses 9 and going through verse 14. 2 men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee, standing by himself, was praying, "God, I thank you that I'm not like other people, thieves, rogues, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week. I give 1/10 of all my income." But the tax collector, standing far off, would not even look up to heaven, but was beating his breast and saying, "God, be merciful to me, a sinner." That's the end of the parable. Now, in the context of Luke's story, it's very clear Jesus is using this parable as a tool against the Pharisees, and it doesn't paint a very pretty picture about them. However, AJ, that's Professor Levine, says on page 40, she's still talking about this parable. She says, if we hear the parable through first century Jewish ears, the ears that would have been listening to Jesus himself, a much different picture develops than the negative one that Luke conveys. First, the Pharisee need not be seen as hypocritical or arrogant. The Pharisee's prayer begins with "I thank." And the idea of thanking God is a major component of Jewish prayers. The Pharisee's prayer, on its own terms, she says, shows no more arrogance on his part than anyone who has prayed or thought, "Well, there, but for the grace of God go I." In other words, and this is saying now, his prayer is he's thanking God. This is the way, by the way, this is the way the first century Jews would have heard it. And he's thanking God that he has had a life that has been more blessed, and for these things that God has given him. I'm back to A.J. Levine now. The negative view of the Pharisee comes from Luke's narrative, not from Jesus' original context. And because of that context, A.J. continues, the parable works. It traps listeners brilliantly. As soon as one makes the determination that the tax collector is justified, and the parable makes that clear, the thought results, well, thank heaven I'm not like that Pharisee over there. All right? But how absurd to think, thank heaven I'm not like Mother Teresa, thank heaven I'm not like Billy Graham. Even if one finds the Pharisee to be sanctimonious, the parable still works, because the identification with the tax collector results in the reaction, thank heaven I'm not sanctimonious like that Pharisee. The irony is delicious. Now let me pause for a second to make sure you understand what she has just said. Most likely, the reaction of the listeners would not have been negative about the Pharisee. That's her point here. However, nevertheless, when you put the tax collector into the story, now it changes the tenor of that story, and all of a sudden you begin to realize, whoa, the tax collector is justified. Okay, now Jesus says even more so than the Pharisee. But the point is that the first thing they would have thought is, my goodness, my Lord, the tax collector is justified before God. And now back to A.J. Levine. The good news of the parable continues. By forcing readers to see something positive about the tax collector, it insists that even those who work for the enemy may still be part of the congregation. That even those who exploit members of their own community, that would be the tax collectors, deserve consideration. Perhaps they, like Zacchaeus, are doing the best that they can while trapped in an impossible situation. In other words, the parable forces hearers to walk in the shoes of the criminal or the ostracized. At the same time, it requires listeners to assess acts of piety and the value placed on them in any religious setting. This Pharisee who tithes, who fasts, who prays without asking anything for himself is exactly the sort of congregant that clergy adore. The parable then raises the question of who has honor in the congregation, who is the better role model, who is without sin, who is without sanctity. That's the end of what Professor Levine has to say on that. She goes on to say more on that. That's the end of my quotation. What she says here, and I hope you're getting this point, is that in this parable, if we listen to it with the ears of a first century Palestinian Jew, they're not going to think so poorly about the Pharisee. I mean, the way Luke uses it again, in the way it's presented in Luke's context, yes, he's the Pharisee is a sanctimonious twerp, okay? But her point is in the original context of this story, and that raises a form criticism question, but we don't have time to get into. But in the original context of this story would have invited the listeners to understand a very important point, and that is that the tax collector is justified before God. And that's not something that they would have thought about before. That is the surprise in this story. They would start with the Pharisee, and they're all going, yep, okay, Pharisees. Oh boy, good for them. Thank God, that they're, they've got lots to thank God for, that they're not like sinners and all these other people. But then the second part of the story brings in the tax collector, who would have been an enemy of the people, who collaborated with the Romans. He was the guy in the French resistance in World War II would have taken a French person like this and shot them. For collaboration. And actually they did after Paris was freed from the Nazis. Anyway, in this case, here's this tax collector who was guilty, in their eyes already. All of a sudden they begin to see that he's justified by God too. And that's a powerful thing. Anyway, I use that to illustrate how important it is for us to try to imagine how the first century listeners would have listened to the story. Okay, we're a lot of lectures here. I'm sorry. Don't forget, this is actually 2 full class sessions that I'm giving to you. So if these seem long, these are 15, 14-minute bites. But all right. Now, why did Jesus speak in parables? Well, I mean, the first answer to this is, well, because they were powerful teaching tools, and they had a long tradition in the Old Testament. All right, but if you go to pericopes 91 through 92 in Throckmorton, the gospel authors have slightly different answers for this question, and we're going to start with Mark in chapter 4, verses 10 through 12, and this is right after Jesus has given the parable of the sower. This is before the allegorical interpretation of the parable of the sower, by the way. Anyway, Mark 4, verses 10 through 12. When he was alone, those who were around him, along with the 12, asked him about the parables. And he said to them, this is verse 11, "To you has been given the secret of the kingdom of God. But for those outside, everything comes in parables, in order that they may indeed look, but not perceive, may indeed listen, but not understand, so that they may not turn again and be forgiven." That's the end of Mark 4, 10 through 12. Now, a lot of people, and I was in the same boat for a very long time, we look at this and we don't really think very carefully about it, because actually we're probably thinking about Matthew's version of this, which I'll get to in a second. Okay? And actually, by the way, Luke repeats Mark's version pretty much so. So it's Matthew, as we'll see, who diverges here. But for Mark and Luke, it's really clear. Jesus' purpose in speaking in parables is actually to not to help people understand. Now, in Mark's gospel, this makes perfect sense if you remember his theme of the messianic secret. Because in Mark didn't want people to understand Jesus without the cross. And in the story, this is only Mark 4, Jesus hasn't gotten to the cross yet. This notion of they're not understanding is important. They will not understand correctly until they understand in light of the cross. That's Mark. For Luke, I haven't given